The Washington Territory of the mid-1800s was an isolated land, sparsely populated and surrounded by imposing physical barriers. Travel to the area was a dusty overland trip that took months, and commercial export was limited to waterways. Residents knew their only hope for growth rested with the arrival of the railroad, but the train would be slow to come. The federal government understood the need for a transcontinental railroad, and in the 1850s dispatched survey teams to determine the best routes. But the Civil War was imminent, and the plans for the railroad were put aside. There were a few privately run trains, but they weren't terribly reliable or convenient. Along the Columbia River, the Oregon Steam Navigation Company ran a railroad where rapids and falls blocked steamship travel. Passengers and freight had to be loaded to and from the train several times to make the journey down the Columbia. Another small train ran from the Columbia to Walla Walla. One passenger described the trip on the Dorsey-Baker line this way. On payment of $2, I was placed on some iron in an open truck and told to cling to the sides and to be careful not to stand on the wooden floor if I cared anything about my limbs. But the lack of a transcontinental train kept the Northwest isolated and limited growth. Finally, in the 1870s, German businessman and journalist Henry Villard gained control of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, the Dorsey-Baker, and later the Northern Pacific Railroad. He then began construction of a cross-country rail system that would connect St. Paul, Minnesota, to Portland, Oregon, and eventually to the small port town of Tacoma, Washington. Chinese laborers made up much of the workforce. It was grueling work, carving a railroad out of the rugged terrain, but in 1883 the line was complete. Though the final gold spike was laid in Helena, Montana, Portland and Tacoma celebrated the arrival of the railroad with pageants and parades. Meanwhile, Seattle residents were frustrated that their city had been left out of the railroad boom. They were determined to get a train through town, even if they had to build it themselves. East Coast businessman James Hill came to their rescue in 1893. He built the Great Northern Railroad and finally linked Seattle to the rest of the nation. By the end of the century, the Northwest was booming. No longer an isolated frontier, Washington was now a state with an ever-growing population and an expanding economy, finally made possible by the arrival of the railroad.